A
Although we
very good
probably
evening.
should be oh, sorry.
A very good evening to you all. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Hyacinth Miller, and I'm a faculty member with the Departments of Political Science and African American and African Studies in the School of Arts and Sciences, Rutgers University, Newark campus. I will also serve as tonight's moderator. The United States presidential election is about 1 week away, and tonight, Rutgers Newark political science faculty will be discussing some of the issues that must be addressed in the next semester, in the next term, not semester. In addition, they will offer a perspective on how these issues may potentially or not be addressed depending on who wins. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my wonderful and brilliant colleagues in the order that they will speak tonight. First, we will have Dr. Simon Reich. Dr. Reich is a professor in the Division of Global Affairs and Department of Political Science at Rutgers Newark. He also serves as a research associate at the Center for International Studies at Sciences-Newark in Paris. He's author, co-author, and editor of 12 books and more than 60 articles or book chapters. His most recent book is a co-edited volume with Thierry Balzac and Peter Dombrowski entitled Comparative Grand Strategy, a Framework and Cases. His next book will be Type, Time and Space, American Grand Strategy in Comparative Perspective with Peter Dombrowski. Dr. Reich will serve as the George Soros Visiting Chair at the Central European University in Vienna, beginning January 2022. Dr. Janice Gallagher is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Rutgers University, Newark. Prior to joining Rutgers, she worked as a postdoctoral fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. She's about to submit her first book manuscript, yay, Janice, entitled Bootstrap Justice, The Search for Mexico's Disappeared. She conducted more than 2 years of fieldwork in Mexico and Colombia and previously worked as a human rights accompanier in Colombia. Next, we'll have Professor Kehinde Togun, who's a senior director at the Arkin Group, specializing in international risk management, business intelligence, and strategic advisory. He's also an adjunct lecturer in the Department of Political Science. Professor Togan was previously the Deputy Director of Partners Global's Sub-Saharan Africa team, where he led the portfolio of anti-corruption, governance, and security reform programs on the continent. Prior to joining Partners, he worked at the National Democratic Institute with stints on the Eurasia, Middle East, and North African and Southern and East Africa teams. The New America Foundation and the Diversity and National Security Network named him one of 20 next generation Black American national security and foreign policy leaders in 2020. Next, we'll have Dr. Domingo Morel, who serves as an assistant professor of political science at Rutgers University, Newark. His research program and teaching portfolio focus on racial and ethnic politics, urban politics, education politics, and public policy. He's author of Takeover, Race, Education, and American Democracy, which won the W.E.B. Du Bois Distinguished Book Award. He's also co-editor of Latino Mayors, Power and Political Change in the Post-Industrial City. One other thing that I'd like to say before I begin. Tonight's introduction should have been given by my colleague, my illustrious colleague, Lisa Hull, but sadly, over the weekend, she lost her mom. Lisa shared that her mom was 102, but died of natural causes. She wants you to know that she and her family are okay, and she'll be in contact with each of us in the near future. With that, I turn to Dr. Reich, and Dr. Reich's talk will focus on Biden's foreign policy with comments on U.S. alliance relations in Asia and Europe, the prospects for renewed American leadership, and the liberal order. So thank you, Dr. Reich.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. And I must say, it's a little daunting as I look at the screen and see all these young, vibrant faces. It's just a reminder of me getting on, you know. I want to devote my time to some general comments. My colleagues, as I understand it, will talk about specific issues and specific areas of the world or domestic issues. Um, I'm going to spend my time talking about similarities and differences between the two candidates. And it used to be the famous adage in American foreign policy was that domestic politics stopped at the water's edge, that we essentially operated under a consensus when it came to foreign policy. But that Cold War adage, coined by Arthur Vandenberg, has long since disappeared in many of the aspects that we talk about in a society that we're regularly reminded has become so polarized. What I'm going to do is talk about areas of difference between the candidates, but I'm going to start by talking about areas of similarity in terms of their foreign policies. And I'm going to go through a list of similarities and then differences relatively briefly given my time. But I'm perhaps you'll be surprised to discover that there are more similarities than you would normally anticipate in other areas of policy. Essentially, the areas of similarity begin with their attitude towards the prevailing wars and America's role in terms of troop deployments in the world. The process of retrenchment of American combat forces that began actually in the Obama administration has been continued in the Trump administration under, especially relatively recently, it's accelerated, at least in Afghanistan. And I suspect, given what Biden has said already, that that process will continue. There's a general belief in Washington in favor of retrenchment and the redesignating of troops, American troops, bringing them home, or at least moving them out of combat zones, and that process will be likely to continue. The second area that's interesting in where in terms of similarities will be in terms of addressing China. Now, if Biden is elected, there will be a significant difference in terms of the tone, perhaps in the demeanor. It might not be so confrontational as it has been with the Chinese, but essentially the propensity will be very similar. Biden is more likely to try and take a multilateral approach in dealing with China by trying to cobble together coalitions of America with European partners, for example, and other partners in Asia. But certainly the prevailing issues with China aren't going away, and the tensions will continue in terms of understanding Chinese claims of sovereignty in the South China Sea, the issue of intellectual property rights, and trade deficits and market access. So although we may see a slightly adjusted tone, it's not going to look so different in terms of the prevailing policy. And that extends to the question of America's role in Asia more generally, in terms of what has been redefined geostrategically from Asia to being the Indo-Pacific. This is a term that has become very popular amongst decision makers in Washington, policymakers, and military officials, and was symbolized by a creation of a new command structure in which Asia was enlarged to become the Indo-Pacific, in which the United States is trying to build, as part of that coalition, for example, India as a partner in dealing with China. The Indians have been quite mercurial about it, and I can certainly answer questions if they're specifically about that. But what we're likely to see is a continuation of the rebalancing to Asia, as the Obama administration designated it in 2010. The third area of similarity lies with NATO. Of course, Trump's treatment of NATO allies and his abrupt behavior towards NATO allies has been very problematic and has been all over the press every time there's a NATO meeting, and the disdain with which he's treated them. That, of course, will change if Biden is elected, but the underlying issue about financing, it remains a really fundamental issue that Obama focused on, Clinton focused on, Trump has focused on, and Biden's likely to do the same. We're very worried about what's known in the parlance as free riders. That is the countries that don't pay their 2% of GDP, which they're supposed to pay in order for NATO membership. That problem is not going away. And so, as I said, the tone will be different, but the issue will be the same, and it needs to be addressed. The Germans, for example, were spending 1.2%. So we were subsidizing them. They have promised by 2025 to get to 1.7%. It's still not enough. And no American president is going to tolerate that and countenance that. So it'll be a continuing issue. The Middle East more generally has become an issue, and the continuities that we will see will be the normalization of relations, or the encouragement of the normalization of relations between Israel and the Gulf states. But there are some things that are no going back on at this stage, right? The recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, no American president is going to have an easy time reversing that decision. It would be quite problematic. Now, where the differences lie are fairly fundamental, and in some cases not as policy specific. I've already talked about the general tone is likely to change. Biden is a proponent of what we have historically known as the liberal order. And the liberal order entails multilateral approaches and the support for international organizations such as the IMF, the World Health Organizations, the United Nations, the areas where Trump has somewhat disparaged these organizations, in some cases like the WHO or UNESCO withdrawn. Biden has recommitted to these organizations. He's also recommitted to the Paris Climate Accord, and there will be some rebuilding going on there. The problem is that the Biden campaign, I should say, and you can go and check this out on his foreign policy area pages on his website. The problem is that he wants to reassert American leadership in the world. I was interested to listen to a Zoom call earlier where Madeleine Albright spoke. And she, of course, is a great proponent of the notion of the United States being an indispensable power. The problem with that position is the world has moved on in the last 4 years. And although many of our allies will be very pleased if Biden is elected president, there's a real genuine question mark about whether they want to embrace American leadership as we have traditionally known it. There's a lot of skepticism about the United States. You know, it's the mistrust that can develop in any relationship. Once you lose that trust, it's very hard to reestablish that credibility and to reassert a leadership position. And so while everybody might be more comfortable with a Biden presidency, for example, our European allies have talked extensively about coming up with European solutions for European problems. This is the adage that was coined by Emmanuel Macron, the president of France. So comfort level aside, the question of whether everybody is willing to embrace the United States once again as an indispensable power in the way that American Democrats think is the case, is really quite problematic. As I mentioned before, we have problems within NATO. And one of the key differences that, and an early challenge that the Biden administration would have to face is what to do about Turkey. Turkey has become deeply problematic in terms of its treatment of other NATO members. And as Albright said today, Turkey is more at this stage of a formal ally than it is a partner. Turkey has the biggest military in NATO outside of the United States, and of course, geographically occupies a fundamentally important position in terms of geography, being the bridge between Europe and the Middle East. And so in that context, like Obama and Clinton and Biden will have to face the issue about how to deal with Turkey in the same way, and as he's going to have to face the issue about how to deal with North Korea. These countries in very different ways represent hotspots. Finally, what are they going to do in terms of the tools that they use? Well, I said there'll be a difference in tone, and that's for sure. And there'll certainly be a difference in the fact that we are likely to see more aid going to places like Central America. We are likely to see less of a use of sanctions. No administration in American history has used economic sanctions as plentifully as the Trump administration. But even as we withdraw from using those sanctions, the question will be, well, what political leverage do we have in dealing with places like Iran, where we have used sanctions so plentifully? We're likely to see a return under a Biden administration to a more traditional American notion of foreign policy. It is more likely to be what William Burns called restorative, rather than the kind of reaction that we've seen to American foreign policy over the last 4 years. But this is a real problem. I'll end with this note that essentially I suggest we don't need a restorative foreign policy. What we need is to reinvent our notion of American foreign policy under very different principles than we're likely to see. The Biden administration has co-opted into its foreign policy team people who are very traditional and well-known to Americans, who served in the previous 2, possibly 3 Democratic administrations. This is not likely, I suggest, to lead to a resolution of lots of the problems that we've been dealing with. So the world may breathe a sigh of relief, but I'm not sure that we're going to see much that's very different in addressing a world that has changed substantially to the last time these people were in power. Thank you. Hyacinth?
Waiting for me. Hello? Okay, excellent. I was waiting to be unmuted. Thank you, Dr. Reich. And next we will have Dr. Gallagher, who will be addressing what this election means for U.S. foreign policy with Latin America and human rights. Go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. And I pivoted away from foreign policy a little bit because I knew that Dr. Reich was going to talk about that. And instead, I'm going to kind of give some more general comments about the kind of the health of our democracy and what I think the questions we should be asking, and some of the things we can learn by kind of drawing on historical examples. So my introductory to comparative politics class, the central question of that class is the US sliding towards fascism? Is US democracy in peril? And does it matter, right? That's essentially what we talk about in my intro to comparative politics class. And while you all don't have the pleasure of taking the class, I wanted to kind of bring in some of the questions and the conversations that we have by way of trying to talk about what I think is at stake in this election. So I guess to kind of to be clear about where I'm coming from, I think. So I'm a comparative political scientist, which means fundamentally what I think about is what can we learn by looking at what happens within different countries. So I think what is happening in the United States and the concerns about whether democracy is being rolled back, about whether we're sliding towards kind of a less democratic and provocatively a fascist system. To me, the fundamental insight of my area of research and of comparativists is that we need to look at other countries. So what do we look at when we talk about this? We look at competition, we look at the state of political participation, and we look at freedom and liberty. So I think I'm going to there's a lot to talk about, of course, with this, and I'm going to gloss over a lot of things. I'm not going to talk about whether political parties are playing the role that they perhaps should, which is by vetting candidates and limiting extremist or anti-democratic leaders. I'm not going to talk about kind of social movement activity. We know we've seen millions, 15 to 26 million Americans on the street this summer in response to the George Floyd killings and kind of inspired by Black Lives Matter. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm happy to talk about in Q&A. I'm also not going to talk about voter suppression, which we know is vital to a democracy. So I'm kind of going to gloss over those things and go into a little more depth on a couple other constituent parts of a healthy democracy. I should say that in the class, we study Hitler's rise in Germany, we study Bolsonaro in Brazil, we study Erdogan in Turkey, Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela, and Orban in Hungary. What they all have in common is that all were in some ways elected democratically, and all of them pulled or are pulling, in Bolsonaro's case and in Maduro's case, are pulling their countries in a less democratic direction, right? So the question is, what do they have in common, and what can we learn by looking at what's happened there? So kind of first thing I want to talk about and that we asked throughout the semester is about leadership, right? So does the leader consistently articulate anti-democratic values? So in our class, we systematically analyzed the speech of leaders who are elected democratically and that succeeded in overthrowing these democratic norms. So we found that even those leaders who subsequently took radical actions later were generally constrained in their speech prior to undermining democratic norms. So Hitler, for example, right? So he indicated prior to his election his willingness to use violence. He embraced inequality as a driving logic and indicated that he would be willing to reject elections, but he didn't make it clear prior to undermining democratic institutions exactly where he was going in terms of the final solution, in terms of his essentially genocidal intent. So I think it's really important that when we lined up these different leaders, only Bolsonaro was willing to put into the public discourse speech which was more essentially hateful and which called into question the equality of all of a country's citizens, right? Which is pretty surprising to us. So when we went through and we kind of coded the speeches that they were giving before they were elected, we looked at what they were actually saying, and in terms of being willing to cast doubt on people's worthiness as citizens, Trump was just below Bolsonaro. Next, we looked at the system of government. One of the main things that we looked at is the institutional and electoral system facilitating anti-democratic leaders coming to power? And if so, how? I think a lot of us, when we started the course, say, what's the essence of a democracy? The essence of a democracy is that what the majority of people want. If the majority of people vote one way, then they get to elect a leader. As we know, that hasn't happened in the US. This also didn't happen in the case of Erdogan in Turkey, and it didn't happen in the case of Hitler in Germany. They came to power without electoral majorities, right? Particularities in their electoral system allowed them to gain power and then use this power to change the rules and preserve power. So what we know in terms of the US, right? The Republicans have won the popular vote for the presidency only once in the last 20 years, and yet have controlled the presidency for 12 of those 20 years. Democrats easily won more overall votes for the US Senate in 2016 and 18, and yet the Republicans hold 53 of 100 seats. The 45 Democrats and 2 independent senators who caucus with them represent more than 53 Republicans. And here I'm drawing directly on recent analysis by Steve Levitsky and Zablat, who have written kind of the book for comparative political scientists sounding the alarm. So how did this happen, and have we tried to fix it? Some of you may know that in the US, we've long known that the Electoral College is anti-democratic. The House, there was a movement in the 1960s when we were expanding democratic rights, when it was time for, it was seen as a time when the power of those who have been historically disenfranchised were being empowered by social movements, but also institutionally. So the House last voted in favor of a constitutional amendment to do away with the Electoral College in 1969. But the proposal died in the Senate, and one of the leaders against this amendment was James Allen of Alabama, who was a staunch segregationist. He said, quote, "The Electoral College is one of the South's few remaining political safeguards." Right? So we've designed institutions. We know that we have designed institutions in the US that have guaranteed non-democratic rule. And that has been a warning sign in a way in other countries for non-democratic leaders to come to power and to preserve it. I'm running a little short on time, so I'll do this one quickly. But another question is, does the system of government provide checks and balances? Is it able to withstand power grabs from the executive? For me, I look most here at Venezuela. When we think about Venezuela and where it is now, a lot of people think, oh, so Hugo Chavez and then his successor Maduro must not have come to power democratically, but they certainly did, right? Hugo Chavez won a landslide election when he was first elected, and it wasn't until the prices, the bottom fell out of the oil market, and Chavez died, charismatic Chavez died, and Maduro came. Maduro was his successor, who was first elected democratically as well. He was elected democratically and then proceeded to undermine checks and balances against him, and then essentially stole elections after that. But I think really importantly, in terms of how strong our institutions are, Venezuela was an established democracy in Latin America. And I should say this is true for Chile too. Chile had a coup. Obviously, Pinochet didn't come to power democratically, but Chile was also seen as a really strong democracy. In both in Chile and Venezuela, we have the courts playing a really important role. The courts, who people thought would stand for democracy and withstand assaults on its independence, in the end were not able to. And I can talk about more of that as why, but I just wanted to kind of, in Venezuela, the replacing of the independence of the judiciary was I would say, one of the primary causes of the erosion of democracy in the country, and has led to has largely led to the state that Venezuela is. And now, in terms of courts in the US, we know that one of Trump's most inarguable accomplishments has been the appointment of a record number of federal judges, as well as Supreme Court justices. Okay, so that's kind of more of the inside politics stuff. In terms of liberty, kind of where are we at? And this is picks up a little bit on what Dr. Reich was talking about. So just kind of big picture, deep breath. What we decided as a world after 1948 was that the way to, for the most people in the world to enjoy a minimum quality of life and the basic rights that people should be entitled to. We all signed, so 45 countries signed a document, including the United States, called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Since then, the idea of human rights, the regime of human rights has been, though flawed in its implementation, has been something that the United States and Western powers have held up as the values to strive for, and it's been part of our foreign policy. And we can talk about, there has been clear violations of that, but it has been part of what we argue for on the world stage. Well, I'll say, so when regimes obviously infringe on civil and political rights, as well as economic and social rights, it is a major warning sign for democracy. I know that, I just want to say that the U.S. has been, it might seem trivial that the U.S. has paid lip service to democracy, but as I'm someone who works in Mexico and Colombia and other Latin American countries with human rights organizations, and the ideals of human rights and the fact that that discourse is present in U.S. foreign policy, that there's financial incentives to comply with human rights norms, to comply with international humanitarian law, those are important tools for people on the ground trying to make their societies more equal, trying to promote justice and political participation. So these things really make a difference. As we know, Trump was elected on a platform of attacking multilateralism, pulling the US out of Paris, obviously, most recently attacking the WHO. And I just want to talk in the remaining time, there's a lot to talk about in terms of Trump and human rights. But one thing that was, that's particularly to me egregious in terms of, because I, as a human rights advocate, is what's happened with asylum. So asylum is everyone, so asylum is the right to seek protection and safety if one is under threat in their home country. This right is enshrined in Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says everyone has the right to seek asylum, to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. So the US historically, again, with the spotty record, since World War II, more refugees have found home in the United States than any other nation. More than 2 million refugees arrived in the US since 1980. And during much of the 1990s, the US accepted more than 100,000 refugees per year. This did change after 9/11, but the Trump administration has launched a full-fledged assault on asylum. Currently, if you apply for asylum at the border, you have to stay in Mexico rather than before being able to come into the United States while you're waiting for your asylum hearing. And most recently, with COVID, the administration has used the argument that we are in a health emergency to cancel essentially. To essentially close the border in many ways, and to even further shut down the system. So this right that is guaranteed in international law, which the U.S. has historically championed, is essentially been completely undermined by the Trump administration. In terms of where are we, and I'll finish up here. So again, so big picture, right? We have a system now in which our leadership has put hate speech into public discourse and tried to enact it into law. We have an electoral system which guarantees non-majority rule under certain circumstances. We have a system in which checks and balances are at risk, and we have a rollback in the support of and implementation of kind of key human rights, key aspects of the international human rights doctrine. On the world stage, we've lost legitimacy in the area of human rights. So I guess the question is, what now? I think what I want to put out there is this idea of a U.S. exceptionalism, right? That kind of democracy is safe in the U.S. I don't think is true. There's, no matter who wins the election, there is going to be rebuilding to do. There's going to be, crucially, there's going to be institutional change needed. I liked what Dr. Reich said in terms of reinventing foreign policy. There's no going back. The US is not in a place in terms of its legitimacy in the world to assume leadership in a ways that it has previously. I think there's good things in that, right? I think that a lot of the ways that the US was operating in the world were deeply flawed, but it's going to look different going forward no matter what, and our democracy is not safe. I'll end there.
Okay, I was just waiting to be unmuted. Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Dr. Gallagher. Next, we will have Professor Togun, who will explore the practical and rhetorical differences that countries in the global South might experience depending on the result of the November elections. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Hyacinth, Professor Miller, my apologies. And I'm sorry to hear about Dr. Hall's mom, keeping her and her family in my thoughts. Really sad to hear that. As Dr. Miller said, I'm going to focus, Professor Miller said, I'm going to focus on the Global South, specifically on the African continent, and really talk about the rhetoric and the demeanor between the two administrations, the two campaigns. And I would say both on tone and in actual things that they might do, they couldn't be more different, right? So President Trump, who's been in power for the last 4 years, famously referred to African countries and Haiti as shithole countries in 2018, which was, I think, the first time he actually engaged with those countries or engaged on those countries. And then took away temporary protective status for a lot of folks who are from specific individuals from various countries who are fleeing horrific situations and taking haven in the United States. As Dr. Gallagher said just now, also shrinking the number of refugees that the US accepts. Notably, in 2021, it's going to be 15,000 refugees that the US takes, which is the lowest that we've ever had. And given the state of the world, is perhaps a very stark difference from where we should be, right? And then there's the notion that he's been very transactional with how he's engaged with countries, right? So Sudan and Israel is the most recent example, where Sudan is a country that was on the state-sponsored terrorism, rightfully so for some time, but has been making a lot of progress and should be off the, many folks would argue Sudan should no longer be on the state-sponsored terrorism list. And the administration seems to agree with this, but most very recently decided that the condition for taking away the status is going to be whether or not Sudan and Israel can negotiate a peace with each other, which is a notable thing, except it's not necessarily exactly how the terrorism list should work. So I think we sort of see the administration moving away from the way that international order works and the way that the US systems and institutions function, and making it a much more transactional system, right? And then we also see that the Trump administration is sort of moving away from things like the ICC. So with the US has always been part of the ICC, and the ICC has a lot of its faults that we can all admit, but certainly the US recently decided to sanction the leaders of the ICC. And that's, I would argue, a problem. And then the last piece is around the WHO. And in the midst of a pandemic, the US deciding to leave the WHO. Many folks have pointed out that both the ICC and the WHO, one of the key components here is that the folks who are leading these institutions are people from the global South, right? So that the US has less respect for international order to begin with under President Trump, but certainly institutions that are being led by people of color or folks from the global South have less legitimacy and less respect from this administration. So that's sort of how I would frame the Trump historically, and perhaps gives us insight into how he might govern were he to continue, because that's what we have to go from. In contrast, I think Vice President Biden wrote a foreign affairs piece in March 2020, and as Dr. Reich talked about what his foreign policy approach would look like, and gave it a pretty expansive view of the US's role in the world, and how sort of the focus on this liberal order, and how the US can reimagine the world and essentially reshape what our interactions look like. And on more specifics, he recently released an agenda for the African diaspora, and it's like, at least by my recollection, the first time that campaign has openly done this and published something on its website that focuses on healthcare, on education, on re-engage, and how the Biden administration would engage with the African continent. And I think for many of us that do Africa-related work, this was heartening for us to see. Again, rhetoric is one thing; how it actually plays in real life is different. But nonetheless, I would agree with Dr. Gallagher that rhetoric matters, and the ability of folks to say that this exists is a step in the right direction. And also another thing that happened recently was, I'm sure many of us have been following the NSARS protests that have been happening in Nigeria, where Nigerians are protesting the police brutality, in particular one unit that has now been disbanded, but certainly there's a lot of work still to be done. And the Nigerian military early this week on the 20th of October responded with brute force, and about 12 people at least that we know of were killed by the Nigerian military by opening fire on peaceful protesters, right? And so Vice President Biden on the day of released a statement that was pretty supportive of the protesters, and calling on President Buhari, Nigeria's president, to respond, both to investigate, but also to not kill his own people who are peacefully protesting. The contrast is the Trump administration eventually did issue a statement 2 days later, but many would argue that it was sort of shamed into doing so, because everyone kept saying, where's the US's leadership on this? And I would also add that a State Department representative met with a Nigerian counterpart and used a pre-scheduled meeting to say something, right? So it's not that the Trump folks did not say anything, it just the demeanor in which they said it, and the platform they chose to use was quite different from how Vice President Biden's camp chose to respond. So I think those are how I would describe how the two views might exist, which might give us insight into how they would govern when they are in power, right? But I also think it's important to sort of reflect on the architecture of the United States and how the foreign policy actually works, right? Because it's one thing to have rhetoric, but I would argue that Dr. Reich is right in the sense that the U.S. government, the U.S. architecture itself doesn't necessarily lend itself to that much of a difference, or may not lend itself to that much of a difference with how they might interface with the world, right? So when it comes to the African continent, unfortunately, we've often seen these countries as recipients of aid and view them through that lens rather than seeing them as equal partners, whether it's in regards to trade, in regards to other strategic priorities that we might have. We've seen them as countries that are poor and that we need to give things to, right? And it's worth noting that during the George W. Bush years, and I'm no fan of George W. Bush, but nonetheless, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief was a marquee policy and a marquee initiative that really did save lives on the continent, right? So there is value to aid, but I would argue that most Africans and most African leaders want to be seen as co-equals rather than as recipients of aid. So I do think that that's an important distinction for how, unfortunately, all U.S. administrations historically have seen Africans in that light. And also many of us who were doing African work in the Obama years were quite frustrated often about how the over-securitization of African countries, right? So we saw them as like this terrorism exists, and so we need to focus on terrorism. Ergo, let's put everything that we're doing around how do we prevent violent extremism on the African continent or having ripple effects across the globe. And the joke for all of us that was often sort of like, if you want something done, frame it around terrorism, because then you would have somebody's attention, right? And we don't want to be back in that space. So there's reason to think that Vice President Biden might revert to what his administration did, his administration as a VP did previously, but there's also hope, there's reason for hope, right? So I would argue that in spite of what Biden's rhetoric might be, it's up to us as individuals to make sure that we are holding him accountable and making sure that we're holding his administration accountable, so the rhetoric that he's using in the campaign is what actually transforms or translates when he is in power. So I think that there's a lot of work for all of us to do to make sure that the promises made are going to be kept, right? I think generally speaking, as folks who are in a democracy, taking everything Dr. Gallagher said, our democracy can only be as lively or as vibrant as we are as citizens are. So I would certainly echo that vociferously and say that there's a lot of work for us to do to make either a Biden presidency or a Trump presidency live the values that we wanted to live as American citizens, right? And I suspect that in a Biden world, the same tensions will exist, right? So the idea of, do we focus on human rights or do we focus on strategic priorities, right? Those are things that every administration has to struggle with. And unfortunately, time and time again, the strategic priorities have often taken a fore at the risk of expanding civic space or supporting civil society actors or supporting media and those in groups that we think are important, right? So we've often taken, what's the strategic priority? Let's focus on that. And I think it'll be incumbent on all of us to make sure that that rebalancing begins to happen, right? That the U.S. rejoins the ICC, that the U.S. becomes again a member of the joins the WHO, sees the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as values that we all care about and that we all need to be actively participating in. And so while they might make the same calculations, it's up to us to help try and make sure that the balance is reimagined, right? And then I think the other piece I would mention, and I will sort of close on this one, is that for us as the United States to be taken seriously by our partners, be it on the African continent or anywhere else, right? Our moral authority needs to return. And the way that moral authority returns is by us actually taking into account the ills that we have in the United States, right? So systemic racism and inequality is something that has always existed. I think the last 4 years, and in particular the last year, has really drawn this home, right? So the idea that I, as a person who's been a democracy promoter across the African continent or in the Middle East, like I've always been able to go to countries and say, this is what you should be doing. Well, those folks should have less reason to take me seriously today than they did a year ago, because we are showing that our institutions are actually not equipped, right? Or that we are failing. And so I think that there's an opportunity for us to actually re-enter the world with a sense of humility, trying to address some of the ills at home, be it how African Americans and Black and Latino folks have worse cases of health, worse health outcomes, right? Or are more likely to be stopped by police. Inequality in our health, in our education, in our criminal justice system. These are all things that we actively need to address to regain that moral authority. And if we don't do this, I think that it's going to be, it's already clear that our competitors or our opponents, whichever word you choose to use, are going to continue to use this to drive a wedge between us, but also use it to reduce our own legitimacy across the globe. So I do think that there is addressing what's happening at home will actually give us an opportunity to actually reimagine and re-enter the world with a sense of humility and perhaps with a sense of purpose, the way that we haven't done previously. So I would argue that the Biden presidency might have a different interpretation or a different outlook for the world than the Trump presidency does. But I would equally and very quickly add that regardless of who's in power, it's incumbent on us to make sure that our American values, or what we consider our American values, are what our leaders use to govern us. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Professor Togan. And last, but certainly not least, our speaker, Dr. Domingo Morel, will round out this conversation by discussing the implications of this election on American race and urban politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Miller, and to all my colleagues. So I had some thoughts, but I've been listening to what my colleagues have been saying, and want to add to some of the things that they're saying, and try to put some context, additional context, I should say, through the lens of American race politics and urban politics, right? And so there are two real, I think, important points that both Professor Reich and Professor Gallagher mentioned, what I want to use as kind of like my points of kind of departure in adding my comments. And that is kind of like the foreign policy consensus and the notion of American exceptionalism, at least when it comes to democratic participation and rights. And so regarding the foreign policy consensus, the scholarship, the arguments have always been that while the American domestic policy has been a place of like great debate and differences between the political parties. When it comes to foreign policy, of course, as Professor Reich was saying, there is a lot more consensus around how we deal with the world. And while that is certainly true, that there is a distinction between domestic and foreign policy when it comes to consensus, I think from the viewpoint of those on the losing end of inequality, those who have been marginalized, racial minorities and others who've been marginalized, that consensus there is a stronger consensus than has been suggested. And that is both Democrats and Republicans have engaged in policies that have led to the unprecedented levels of inequality that we're dealing with today. Both Democrats and Republicans, as Professor Togun was talking about, were complicit in the rise of mass incarceration in the United States, right? And while many have celebrated the idea of American democracy, and in some ways, as Professor Gallagher was saying, this American exceptionalism, which she questions, right? She's critiquing, and rightfully so. Again, the view from those marginalized suggests something different. That is a very much a contested idea that there is this exceptionalism and that there's a strong American democracy because, of course, for most of our history, many people have been excluded from the political process. And some would argue, as I would argue, that we've never had a heyday of the American democratic participation, that it took the civil rights movement, of course, to get people the opportunity to participate. And then we're seeing now, 40, 50 years after, the many ways that we've kind of reproduced these types of inequalities and excluded people from participating. So I just want to mention those points that these are kind of things that we've been dealing with. But if we take the point of view from those who have been pushed out, who've been excluded, there's a very different picture that emerges. And so with that said, everybody says that every election is important. Of course, every election is important. And this election is, equally, if not more important for many reasons. But, despite the kind of the consensus, the equal fault of the parties in providing the conditions that we're dealing with today, as I mentioned, inequality and some of these other concerns, there is a clear difference in this election, clear difference. If you are concerned about the way that the pandemic has been handled and want to see something different, if you are concerned with this moment of racial reckoning and dealing with issues, constructively dealing with racial issues, if you are concerned again with inequality, if you're concerned with climate change and environmental justice, then the differences are pretty clear, right? One party is at least having a debate about this, and the other party is completely absent from these discussions. And so the question really is, to what extent are Americans going to turn out to express these clear differences, right? Because the polls actually show that on these issues, the pandemic, social movement, Black Lives Matter, climate change, inequality, that most Americans feel that we need to go into it in a different direction. That the way that it's being handled, at least right now, is inadequate, right? And so there is a preference that has been expressed. Now the question is, will people turn out to express those preferences, right? And more importantly, I would argue, will people be allowed to come out and express these preferences? And so on the latter, we do see evidence that people are participating at higher levels than we've seen in the past, and certainly compared to 2016. And one of the more promising data points is seeing how young people are participating, those between the ages of 18 and 29, compared to 2016 at this point of early voting, right? And so that is promising, because of course, as political scientists, one thing that we always say is, yes, while young people have been at the forefront and are the engine, right? They're the fuel that leads to change, the social movement. On the other side, they don't participate in the electoral politics as frequently as other age groups. And so this is promising on the side of voter turnout. What is not promising is what we've seen happen in states across the country, Georgia and other places, where voter suppression is quite clear, right? So you see lines, people having to wait 7, 8 hours in line to vote. That's clearly a sign of an unhealthy democracy, as Professor Gallagher was pointing to. These voter suppression tactics, including voter IDs and some of these other things that are preventing people, that with the intent of preventing people from participating in the political process. We're starting to see the effects of the Shelby case, the Supreme Court Justice case, stripping the Civil Rights, the Voting Rights Act, right? And so these kinds of, while it's promising that people are, turning out, and despite these efforts to prevent people from participating, people are turning out and they're waiting in line. A healthy democracy shouldn't have to experience that, right? And so we have a lot of work to do. And so, the last thing I would say about this, I guess two final points about this, because I really would like to engage in conversation with our audience. The first is that when you are on the losing side, on the losing democratic side, right? When your views are in the minority and do not have a home within a democracy, then the institution that is best suited to protect you are the courts. And this is why, as Professor Gallagher was saying, the courts are so important in some of these other regimes. And it's so important to this Republican conservative regime. Without the courts, then their agenda that has been used to, for many reasons, in many ways, to deal with, preventing people from participating, promoting policies that lead to further inequality, these kinds of things. Without the courts, then those policies are less likely to be successful in this age because of the reckoning that we're dealing with in this moment, right? And so it's critically important for them to get their people in the courts for those reasons. And then, finally, I just think that to kind of echo many of the comments that have been said already, I think we really need to think about as citizens, as people who participate, who are at least trying to participate in the political process. What is it that we want to see out of American democracy, right? For all of its flaws. I think that this is a moment of reckoning in so many ways. And I don't think that, like, as I tell my students, I think what we need is an imagination, right? To use our imagination to see something different. We've never had a heyday of American democracy where everybody has had an opportunity to participate, but we can, right? And we need to envision that. And there are people who've been doing that work for a long time, and we need to learn from them and push this forward. So I'll end it with that. And really would like to welcome comments and opportunity to discuss this further with my colleagues and the audience.
Thank you so much, Professor Morel. And there are a few questions on our YouTube channel. So I will begin by asking the first three. And the first one is by Wallace. Can a representative system really be democratic? And he followed that up by asking, is there a connection between nationalism and democracy? So anyone, feel free to go ahead and tackle that question, those questions.
Well, so I could try the first one and then, let my comparativist and others deal with the nationalist question, right? Can we, if I understood the question correctly, can we have a democracy can we have a representative democracy? Am I correct, right?
Can a representative system really be democratic?
Yeah, well, I think that the answer is yes, right? For many reasons, we can't have a direct democracy. We are too large of a nation. Some states are just too large in a geographical space to be able to allow citizens to come to the table together to deal with these issues. I do say, with the emergence of the virtual space, as a way to come together, I think it does. I do think it creates opportunities that didn't exist before to deal with direct democracy in ways that just were impossible before, right? So that's a possibility there. But otherwise, the best way to get people together to deal with collective issues is through a representative democracy. And so I think it's very possible. The reason why we haven't had a representative democracy that functions for all Americans is because of our inability to recognize that all citizens should be part of the process, and that is the major issue, right? The exclusion of citizens, either because of race or some other variables, from being part of the democratic process. So I'll just leave it there. I do think that there is, that there is a way for a representative democracy to work, and B, that there is an opportunity now, I think, through virtual spaces to bring people closer to what I suspect Wallace is suggesting here, more of a direct democracy than a representative democracy.
I would add to that, if I could, that I completely agree with Professor Morel there, because I think what we have now is a system where voter suppression and various things are happening to make us less democratic, right? So it's not a function of can representative democracy work, it's are we cheating this, or is our system being cheated, or are we being cheated? So I don't think it's a function of it's the wrong thing, it's the people have figured out how to sort of garner the system and therefore take away our rights to be represented, right? So whether it's the Electoral College and how it's currently being used and not being reformed, or how various laws are passed to actually further marginalize people. But I don't think the problem is the representative democracy. It's that our leaders are unfortunately pretty good at making sure our voices are stifled.
Just to jump in, I know we have a lot of questions to get to, but I think it's an important one. I mean, I think to me, it's not there. It is really a spectrum, right? We don't think about kind of whether it's a democracy or not, right? And how perfect it is. I think in Wallace's, now I lost it, but yeah, can representative system really be democratic? Like really be democratic in terms of the ideals, the highest ideals of what you would want for democracy, that everybody has a voice and that different interests really are represented faithfully. I mean, I think the question, I think for me, the revision of that question is, how do we get closest to, how do we improve our democracy, and what are the ways, what are the important parts of making a democracy healthy? I just want to, it's a hard time just to one hopeful thing to say. Over the weekend, some people might have heard Chile voted to have to write a new constitution, right? So their constitution that they've been living with is a constitution that was written during the Pinochet era. And so even though Chile has been a democracy technically since 1989, it has been 1990, it's been deeply flawed. For example, guaranteeing Pinochet kind of permanent, I think he was a senator, permanent status, and in a lot of ways kind of enshrining the neoliberal economic policies of his administration. So to me, it's a good example. So it was a democracy since then, but really deeply flawed. And I think most markedly, we had huge protests in Chile this year, essentially responding to the huge inequality that there was in the country. And now 78% of the people voted overwhelmingly to write a new constitution and to try to do something really different with their society than they've been doing. So I think the question is, and so kind of Chileans en masse said, yeah, democracy is important. We've been on the streets for it, and now we're voting overwhelmingly to try to do it better. So I think to me that's the framing of it, is what does it take? I think we all talked about doing the work. What does doing the work look like to make it less flawed, and to make sure that different voices are heard, and to me, to lessen inequality, to make sure the promise of democracy which I think kind of fundamentally is about freedom and opportunity for people, and for people to have the minimum that they need to live a good life. How do you get closer to that ideal? I'll stop there.
Thank you. Dr. Reich, can you take up the question about the connection between nationalism and democracy?
Sure.
if there is a connection.
Well, yeah, well, the implication of Wallace's comment was that somehow nationalism and democracy are antithetical to each other. And he won't be surprised to hear me go back to the 1870s and to distinguish between forms of nationalism in Europe, between the Italian version of nationalism and the German. And the distinction there is between the kind of nationalism that we associate in general today, right, which is a sort of othering, an exclusive notion of nationalism, which has tended to predominate, at least in Western societies, as opposed to the Italian version at the time, because Italy wasn't a country then. It was in a process of being formed. And so Garibaldi and the Italian nationalists wanted, for very obvious political reasons, to have a very inclusive form of nationalism. And those still exist in our world today. We tend to think of nationalism and associate it with the German kind, Traischke, which was very exclusive. But, you know, if you turn to somebody from France, right, and you say, talk to them about nationalism, they would proudly say, nationalism is extremely inclusive in France. It's the fundamental, secularism and nationalism are the two fundamental features of the Republic, you know, and then in that sense, multiculturalism, as we would call it in the United States, exists in many elements of France. Now, of course, there are problems in France as there are anywhere else, and I can detail them at length, but there is nothing fundamentally incompatible between democracy and nationalism. It depends on the type, right? And if you have an Enlightenment form that embraces multiculturalism in all of its aspects, then there is nothing wrong to, I don't know, be crass about it, but there's nothing wrong with patriotism. There's nothing wrong with pride. There's a difference between pride and hate, pride and arrogance, pride and exclusion. And these are the kind of aspects that we seem to talk about that tend to predominate in American politics today. But that doesn't mean, talking about reimagining, which is a theme of this panel, I think, there's nothing wrong to think about reimagining in a very healthy kind of a way.
Thank you. The next question is from TT, who asks, in what ways do you think the two-party system, I'm assuming in the US, also limits democracy and voter participation? And by extension, will you see the emergence of a third party? That's not directed toward anyone in particular.
So
I have a short answer.
Okay.
If I may just.
I was going to do the low-hanging fruit. But go ahead, Dr. Reich.
In the United States, these are not political parties, right? They're broad-based umbrellas which coalesce every 4 years to call themselves political parties. But you know, anything that can accommodate Trump and Ben Sass, is not a political party. Okay, so when you talk about the party system in the United States, it has a totally different meaning from, say, in the European context, right? Where the Democratic Party would be at least two parties, and so would the Republicans. So that doesn't leave too much room for a third party to emerge as a serious candidate, because what you have is not two parties to start with. You have two umbrellas that are very broad.
Dr. Gallagher and Professor Togan?
Not to make a, I don't think what the question, person who asked the question is a brief kind of lesson on majority versus plurality versus, like, anyway, all the different forms of government. I would just say that I work in a lot of countries where you have proportional representation, so you have proliferation of parties, right? So you have the, I don't know, I always go back to, I talk about this in the US, remember the rent is too damn high party, right? So that is not gonna get a majority, that's not gonna win any seats, but if that was in Latin America, or if then, and it got 2% of the vote, if there was a vote threshold, they would have 2% of Congress, right? So so we know that different countries allocate their especially congressional seats differently, and therefore and therefore you have minority opinions having representation in a way that you don't in the US. I think the trade-off is, the thought is that with fewer parties, it is more efficient in some ways, because when you have, a bunch of parties, when you have, I think in some contexts you have, 60, 70 parties. When you have that number of parties, it can make actually getting policy passed really complicated, because you have to constantly remake electoral coalitions. So in that way, so if you have a voice in Congress, but you actually can't get anything passed, is that better than not having a voice and getting some things passed? And I would say, and again, I'm treading on especially Dr. Morel's territory here. I don't study the US primarily. I increasingly look at it in comparison to Latin America. But I think in the US, we in some ways are seeing the worst of both. I mean, we're seeing both inefficiencies, and we're seeing kind of stalemates in lawmaking, or at least we were. I guess that's more true when we had more balance. I mean, when we had more checks, when we had more, when the presidency was controlled by a Democrat and we had the houses of Congress controlled by Republicans, then we were seeing a stalemate rather than kind of any kind of efficiency. So I think that's the worst of both systems. Anyway, so I think what I would say, that's a long answer. Yeah, I'll stop there. Okay.
Professor Togan?
Yeah, I would argue that two-party systems, I mean, that's what we have here, right? At least practically speaking. I do agree with Dr. Reich that ultimately these are actually four parties, essentially, if you think of the breakup, how you would break up the Democratic Party and the Republican Party into sort of different ways. I think that you probably have four parties. I don't think that that's still antithetical to voter participation, but I do think that what's ultimately happened is the parties do what's most efficient for them, which is essentially, unfortunately, creates a risk of not going after voters like Black and Latino voters who perhaps would be low-hanging fruits in some sense, but you actually have to do something to get them, right? So they've been taken for granted. And I think that the two-party system has allowed that to happen. But I will say, outside of the voter participation piece, I think on a governing approach, right, I think the two-party system, at least where we can't find compromise, has created a loss, right? Like, so it used to be that the two parties would somehow have like the McCains and like the gangs of eight, right? And that opportunity to have bureaucracies or have work happen in a different, not bureaucracy, have politics happen in a different way that I think we're much more polarized for that to happen today. So to the extent that we're, I don't actually know if we want to go back to that world, but certainly to the extent that compromise is possible, that's probably much more possible in a system that is not just two parties that are so starkly different. But Dr. Morel is the expert here, so I'm actually going to stop talking.
Just a couple of thoughts. Our institutions make it really hard to have more than two parties, right? So our electoral college obviously favors a two-party system. And so if you are a third party and have like no chance of getting the presidency because of the electoral college, then it discourages people from supporting you. So that's one major institutional barrier to supporting more than two parties. Another institutional barrier is that Congress is really designed to accommodate two parties. So that's another institutional barrier. And so because of these institutional barriers, it just discourages people from running on third-party platforms, right? But what we have had in history, and we may be enduring at this point, is a realignment, right? What we call realignment within the parties, with the central consensus, if I should say, changes within parties, and we may be experiencing that now. And so within the Democratic Party, there's significant tension between the more progressive wing, right? Like, although Bernie Sanders does not consider himself a Democrat technically, you know, he doesn't have a home outside really of the Democratic Party, so he's a Democrat, right? So you have the Bernie Sanders and the AOC wing fighting it off with, you know, the Wall Street supporters, the more centrist Democrats, and increasingly disaffected Republicans who are trying to find a home and can't find it in the Trump Republican Party. And so as they try to find a home, and the Democratic Party, because they are, you know, a big tent party, as the Republican Party, you would think they're a big tent party. Because of that, they would want to welcome these disaffected Republicans into the tent. However, by bringing them in and welcome them in, it's just going to exacerbate the existing tensions within the Democratic Party, right? And so I think these are real debates. And it remains to be seen where we go as political parties. I mean, I could envision a situation where there will be, for a short term, a third party, and you know, maybe like the Trump party. If he loses the election, there's still going to be that element of the party that is not going to want to deal with the Republican Party. You got Republicans who want to obviously stay in power or gain power, and they realize that the path to that, I mean, this voter suppression stuff can only get you so far. I think, you know, where people are becoming increasingly aware about it and are challenging it, and so they're going to have to think about other ways beyond voter suppression. And so in some ways, maybe adopt a George W. Bush or, older school, you know, Lincoln Chafee Republican Party from Rhode Island, that type of approach where, you know, they can accommodate, you know, the moderates within the party. So I think that there's a lot of tensions that, you know, while we might not see the strong third party emerge because of our institutional arrangements, that there is enough tension within the parties to lead to some sorts of realignments in the future, the short future.
Thank you so much. And I just realized that we are all political scientists and we all have a lot to say. So in the interest of time and all of these very engaging questions that could each themselves be a session, I'm going to target the remaining questions to specific professors. And before I do that, Honey Lazar wants to say hello all the way from Cleveland, Ohio. So that makes this a national broadcast. There, I'm going to jump around also just to make sure that I get all the different types of questions being posed. So I'm going to address this to Dr. Reich, and you can write it down. I'm sure there'll be another one, but don't answer it just yet. So Victor asks, can the US alliance system handle a second term of a Trump administration while Russia and China are trying to separate America from its allies? So that's one to Dr. Reich. Another question from Victor is, Senator Harris calls the pandemic the greatest failure of any presidential administration in the history of our country. Do you think the Biden-Harris ticket is using this as some sort of fear tactic similar to 2016? So I will let Professor Morel handle that one. I'll direct this one to Professor Togan. How will the relationship between the United States and the UK, well, Professor Togan or Professor Reich, how will the relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom change with regards to policy toward continental Europe in general and the EU specifically? Here's another one from Chester. Historically, the 18 to 29-year-old demographic in the US, I'm assuming, has had the lowest turnout to vote. Why is it? Here's another question about from Garen. Would congressional term limits place the focus back on policy, or would they improve or worsen the candidate pool? That's very interesting. There's a question from Dragana for Dr. Gallagher specifically. If Trump were to win this election again, how do you believe that his anti-immigration and isolationism policy will further affect Latin and Central America in the next term? And lastly, I will leave this with Professor Togan. There are many who feel the UNDHR carries a heavy Western tilt or bias. How do we get these nations, peoples to buy into these ideals? And as moderator, I have a question. As this panel is happening, there is potentially a new Supreme Court justice being sworn in. Do you feel that the court should be stacked? Many scholars of Black history have noted that the Supreme Court has not necessarily been a court that benefited the rights and positionality of minorities in the US context. So the general question is, what is the role of the courts, either here or globally? And I'll leave it at that. I know it's a lot. We have about 40 minutes, so go. Any one of you can feel free to start with your questions.
Okay. Well, Victor's question is very good. By the way, Garen's question, I won't try and answer it, but it's also a very good question about term limits. I thought that was excellent. All right, so can the alliance system survive? And the answer, of course, like a good political scientist, is yes and no. The no is pretty obvious, right? The no is that the challenges are too significant. The centrifugal forces are too great. Trump's incapacity to fall out of love with Putin and to recognize and address the China challenge adequately, because he focuses it in terms of his electioneering. So what we will probably see most likely in terms is a Russian closeting, a closeness that confounds Trump's critics and confuses most of us, with greater tensions with China that will be ill managed because they will be done unilaterally. So that's the no part. Can we survive the yes part? The yes part is that I spend a fair bit of my time looking at continuities and changes in American foreign policy. And I tell my students that the one thing they should completely do is ignore the tweets. The tweets are, they should get rid of Twitter, and they should certainly not listen to any discussion about what the president said at 3 o'clock in the morning when he was sitting there in a mad phase. Because what happens is he tweets something outrageous in the middle of the night, and then the next news cycle is about the tweets as opposed to what's really happening. Now, if you study what's really happening, in my realm, boring things that we don't like to talk about, like troop deployments. You know, who in international relations actually looks at what troop deployments look like, right? I mean, you know, this is boring stuff, right? But when you study these kinds of operations, what you discover, and in this case, this might be heartening, is much more continuity with, say, the Obama administration than you imagined. I gave an example before about the reorientation towards, in terms of American military forces and material towards Asia. And that has basically was started by President Obama in 2010, and it's continued unabated. So underlying this at the one rhetorical level is a propensity to see the whole system, the alliance system, fall apart completely. But when you look at the underlying operation, I mean, when Trump makes this grand announcement and says he's moving troops out of Germany, and we all go, oh my goodness, this is the end of NATO. And then what we discover is he's actually moving them a few hundred miles into Poland. And that movement will take years. This is not a simple process. It's not like, oh, we're packing our bags and we're going. Okay, this is not the case. What we're doing is we're seeing a plan that will take 3 or 4 years to work its way through the system. So underlying that concern is, understandable. But I think I hope, I believe that we can survive it. If we have time, I'll come back and make a couple of brief comments on the pandemic, but I just want to defer to my colleagues at this point. I spoke for too long.
So I'll tackle, I guess, 2 questions and maybe come back to some others later. And I'm tackling these 2 because they're, I think, in some ways connected. And that's the term limit question. I'm not a fan at all of congressional term limits. I think that by trying to place term limits, I think we fool ourselves in thinking that, by bringing new people in, that things will be different. And really, the issue is really systemic and institutional rather than personal. So I tell my students all of the time, there are 2, there are two rules that you should always follow when you're thinking about politicians and whatever policies they enact or try to enact. And that is the rule of getting elected and staying elected, right? And so they're going to do the kinds of things that they need to do to get elected and stay elected. And so if our incentives are that you get nothing done and you'll still get elected, then we need to change the incentives, right? And change the systems that allow for that rather than the people, because the people will remain the same. So for those reasons, I'm not a fan at all of congressional term limits. I think that we need to rearrange our institutions to allow for different types of arrangements, essentially, right? So that is connected to a question that you asked for, Hyacinth, about the packing of the courts, right? And so I think it's long overdue, a serious conversation about the courts, about how many members at the Supreme Court we're talking about here, how many members on the Supreme Court we should have. And of course, there's nothing in the Constitution that says we only can have 9 members, right? And so in the past, we've had less than 9 and even more than 9, right? So we can have, it will be entirely constitutional to do this. Now, if you're going to go about bringing justices, nominating and voting in Supreme Court justices the way that we've had it done over the past 4 years, which is denying Obama the opportunity to have his nominee have hearings and then get a vote, right? And then quickly go through this process with the replacement of Ruth Bader Ginsburg in a way that many Americans feel is not right, then I think, that gives us I think the duty essentially to really question what is really happening here, and if the way that we're going about this makes sense. So I think that we need to have conversations about term limits. So here's where I do think term limits should be part of the conversation. Should justices, because it's very different than congressional members, should justices have term limits? That's a question I think we need to think about. Should we expand the courts to beyond the 9 to have some geographic and some other diversity within it? And so I think that's where we need to be talking about, not just packing the courts. I think that is part of it, but I think that there's other reforms that can be considered as well, particularly after what, I agree with you, what happens to, what seems to be quite clear is going to happen tonight, that the Republicans will vote to confirm the Supreme Court nominee and have a 6-vote majority.
I'll take the question on the US and Europe relationship. And I think for me, one of the things that's been clear, I think for many of us, it's that our allies, we've left our allies behind. And to Dr. Reich's point earlier, at some point we either need to go back to them and sort of revisit that relationship and make it right, or we're going to be left behind. I think we've seen examples like the Iran nuclear deal, for example, where we've walked away and they've said, actually, we're continuing. Or so we've seen examples of the US being sort of batted down by our allies. And we've seen countries like Turkey actually say, actually, we're going to go towards Russia, and even though we're NATO members, right? So we've sort of seen the U.S. relationship or the U.S.'s stature diminished, both among our allies. Turkey being a NATO member is an ally as well, but certainly views us differently these days. But I would argue that until that, in a new administration, a Biden administration, those relationships need to be revisited and need to be made right, because otherwise we are going to be in for a worse scenario more than 4 years from now, right? Because as somebody asked the question of, well, can we survive another 4 years of Trump? I would argue if things continue the way that they are, if the Trump presidency looks like it does today, we cannot survive another 4 years, both globally, but also for the lives of those of us that are in marginalized communities in the United States. But I'll sort of button that for a bit. The second question was around the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and being Western values. And I would actually, certainly they were written by folks in the West, but I would actually I dispute the premise of that question, right? Because I think, having worked with many folks who are in developing countries, they use the UDHR as a piece to actually get work done, right? And the fact that those things exist, everything that is in that document is actually foundational. And I've worked with folks who say, we believe these values and we hold them dear, and we actually will use them to hold our leaders accountable, right? So I don't think they're necessarily values that people need to be sold on. The idea that everyone has the right to exist and exist in a particular way that is meaningful to the world and meaningful to them is not intrinsic to the United States, right? Folks in Nigeria, folks in Ghana, folks in Zimbabwe all want those rights. So I don't actually think they need to be convinced that those are values that they want. It's more so, do we as a world, when we are interacting with these folks, do we engage with them as human beings, and do we engage with them as equal partners? So they may not like the approach that we've used in when and how we wield various UN instruments, but the document itself is actually, I think, a valuable document. I would encourage everyone that's watching to go read the UDHR. Actually, yeah, it's a beautiful piece of work. So I don't actually think it needs convincing for the rest of the world. But Janice actually studies the UDHR, so I want, if you don't mind, you should chime in on that as well. And I'll stop talking.
Great. I totally agree with what you just said. Essentially, I think I just pulled up. Yeah, so Latin America is actually the highest. Has ratified more treaties than any other human rights treaties than any other part of the world, right? So in terms of Latin America, the human rights discourse has become, I'd say, a main fulcrum of claimants who want the state to do better and to stop killing them or to stop. So I think especially coming out of the period of the 70s and 80s of military dictatorships, US supported military dictatorships in most countries, human rights was the main framework that most people used to as their chosen discourse to resist that. So it's not, at least for Latin America, there isn't buy-in, if anything. Most, I'd say, democratic advocates, as well as people who call themselves defensores, which is human rights defenders, are really longing for a stronger international human rights system. They're longing for US leadership in terms of denouncing human rights abuses. Like quick example, with the disappearance of the 43 students in Mexico, there was international outcry, but then Obama met with the Mexican president at the time, and there's no evidence that he brought up the missing of these students, and really the air went out of the sails of that movement because they learned there wasn't really an international cost for disappearing students. So anyway, I totally agree with you. I want to take up Dragana's question next, which is, if Trump were to win the election again, how do you believe his anti-immigration and isolationism policies will further affect Latin and Central America in the next 4 years? And I mean, not to be too dramatic, but I think the answer is more people will die who shouldn't die. I mean, there is a human cost to Trump's policies. And it comes in several forms, right? So I think there has been an explosion of violence fueled by prohibitionist policies of drugs, right? And the US market for consumption of drugs is what pours fuel on the fire and creates the financial incentives for drug cartels in collusion with most governments in Latin America to go to war essentially over who controls the drug trade and who gets those profits, who gets access to the lucrative US market. So as long as the US maintains the status quo, which I should say is largely the status quo since Nixon. I mean, it's a long-term policy of drug war. So since the end of the Cold War, the drug war has predominated in terms of US foreign policy in Latin America, and that hasn't significantly shifted. I would say Latin America, I don't think is Trump's, even though kind of it's not his area of expertise. He, despite kind of focusing on the southern border and kind of talking about the Northern Triangle countries, he hasn't actually done much to shift any of the dynamics. I mean, he's made it, except for making it more difficult to people come into the U.S., sending people back to countries where they're trying to escape from. So there's a human cost to that. But in terms of he hasn't actually cut U.S. aid. He hasn't shifted our funding priorities. He tried to cut aid by 30% by a third in 2018, by 30% in 2019, and 18% this year. But those cuts were largely they didn't go through. Right, Congress together with institutionalized military interests made sure that essentially there was, again, as Professor Reich said, if you look at not the rhetoric, but if you look at and kind of not just the rhetoric and what Trump wanted, he didn't get done, right? There wasn't a major realigning of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. So we have the kind of what's the status quo, which is high levels of violence, especially, I shouldn't say throughout Latin America, right? When we're talking about the high levels of violence, we're talking about Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and we're talking about kind of a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. I don't think any of those things shift, and they get worse, and they kind of have their own dynamics. And again, it's not like the U.S. is a neutral player, because the U.S. fuels, so with our foreign aid and kind of historically with our policies, we've destabilized these countries, we've funded militarization, and through our domestic drug consumption and our prohibitionist policies, we incentivize violence. All of those things really spell they cost a lot of lives in Latin America. So that's the effect. Sorry.
Thank you for that. I believe we got through that. We have about 20 minutes left. So I had a question about Armenia and Azerbaijan and the potential role one of the two candidates will play in helping to resolve that issue if it's resolvable. There is a question from Christian who says, we can clearly see a divided country. Many may say it's due to the era of misinformation because of social media and the mass media involvement. So what can be done to reunite this country? And I think that's a particularly good question, since we are using social media as a platform right now, in essence, to communicate. There's a question for Professor Togan. You briefly mentioned the End SARS movement in Nigeria. What would you consider to be the best way for the United States to respond? And I am aware of other movements across the continent. So if you can speak to those issues, particularly the anti-women violence in Southern Africa. There is another question. Professor Morel, what institutional changes would you prescribe? Ranked choice voting, judicial reforms, campaign finance reforms, and then we'll wrap it up from there. So thank you, students, and whoever's in the audience participating. You can go ahead. So Dr. Reich, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Trump, and Biden.
That question was directed to me. I wasn't quite sure. Now, this is a classic example of, if I may say, and no disrespect to the person who posed the question, of this sort. It was you. Okay. Well, sorry. Okay, I'll be direct. This is a fundamental example of Americans overstepping on the assumption that somehow or other they can get involved in something out there and play a positive, useful role. Okay. This is a conflict whose bases lie in the Armenian genocide. So we're talking about, over 100 years ago now, in which you have a series of players in the region, and I'm talking about external actors, Turkey, Russia, in which the United States capacity to play any kind of quote leadership role. I mean, my colleagues alluded to the fact that the United States thinks of itself as an indispensable power or an exceptional power, whatever. No, we are not in a position, unfortunately, to be able to address that kind of role right now, especially with two countries that have a very complicated relationship with each other, that is Turkey and Russia, of which we are not on good terms with either of them. So fundamentally, this is going to play itself out where we can say lots of nice things, whoever's in the administration, but we have no leverage. May I just, because I'm going to then defer to my colleagues, I just wanted to make one point about the unintended consequences of the pandemic, because a couple of people mentioned COVID-19. And I just wanted to say that one of the things, while we understandably focus on issues concerning COVID, like, you know, national plans and whether we're going to have a national plan, and we talk about things like the unintended consequences for different parts of minority populations. But what has also gone on here that might be interesting is this, that since the end of the Second World War, whether it was within NATO, etc., the United States basically promoted itself and was regarded by the world as a security guarantor. That is, we provided the basis for security to our alliance partners. And one of the things that COVID-19 has exposed is the fact that we are now completely reliant for our security on foreign actors. That is, we can't produce enough PPE, we can't produce enough ventilators, we don't have the domestic capacity to produce a vaccine in large enough figures, even if we develop a vaccine ourselves. The pharmaceutical, medical, industrial complex that we have is not in a position to do any of these. And so one of the things that has become painfully apparent that a new president, if it's Biden, will have to deal with is the fact that when he talks about things like we need domestic manufacturing for national security reasons, that is a long-term project that we're going to have to rebuild. Otherwise, this will not be the last pandemic. This, I'm not just talking about COVID-19 itself, I'm talking about beyond that. We are only 1 or 2 mutations away from something that would be as, if not more, dire. And therefore, in terms of national security, we have moved from being a security guarantor to a security consumer. And that's a debate that we're going to have over the next couple of years as to how we're going to address that.
I would agree with that, Dr. Reich. On the NSARS question, so I think when the US is best, right, what we do is we use our voice to give a platform to other folks, right, to civic actors, usually, if we're doing this correctly. And we've always done this even when we've had a contradiction in our own policies, right? So the US has never been great on human rights, particularly a country that previously enslaved folks, right? Or a country where African Americans could not vote in this country until the 1960s, right? So I think that we've never really met the mandate of what we've promised, right? But nonetheless, other countries have used our foundational documents in their own advocacy for rights. So I think that when we're at our best, it's when we're capitalizing on that platform that we have and using it to give cover to folks, right? So I think that that's an important sort of framing for this NSARS movement. Having said that, I think the biggest thing that the US can do to be an ally in this case is actually solving police brutality at home, right? Like if we're not brutalizing our own citizens and not using the state's apparatus to oppress our own people, we could actually be a real voice for change in the world. So I think that actually starting at home is the first step in this direction. And with Vice President Biden's rhetoric certainly sounds like he's committed to that. Again, it's one thing to be committed rhetorically, so I think when you're in power to actually do that. So I think to Dr. Morel's point earlier, this election actually has consequences, and that could be one potential consequence that we see, to be determined, but we will see. But I think in terms of the practical things that the US could do, right? So there's bilateral and multilateral pressure that we can put on President Buhari, who's the president of Nigeria, right? And say, and have other countries and ourselves, not just issue statements, but actually say, we're watching, we're paying attention. And no country wants to be a pariah. Well, few countries are okay with that, but Nigeria certainly doesn't want to be a pariah. And President Buhari does not want to govern over a country that is seen as one that's brutalizing its people, like he did earlier this week. So I think to the extent that there's more leaders around the globe that are saying out loud, this is not okay, and the US actually using our voice to say that is something that we can do more actively. But going back to the civic voices earlier, so I think the US can give cover to domestic actors, those folks those young people predominantly who are on the streets, protesting regularly, the extent that we can actually convene them and sort of give them a platform through various ways within the US. That's something else that we can do. And I think finding ways to sort of bring movements together, and this doesn't have to be the US itself as in like the US government, but US actors can play a role in this. The idea of social media and social movements sort of happening across the continent right now and across the globe in many ways is something that I think is actually positive. So I think this is another place where social media has catalyzed and continues to catalyze. And I think that there are ways that we as users of social media and we in the United States can actually be a force. So whenever I get the question of like, what can the US do? I have to think, what can we as individual citizens also do? It's not to just, what can our government do? There are things that we individually can do, whether it's donating to folks, paying attention, reading the news, and sort of getting a handle on what's happening there, because that's how we can be better positioned to then actually try to figure out what can we individually do, because oftentimes governments don't do enough. It's what do we citizens do that I think is part of the solution to these problems.
Thank you, Professor Morel.
Yeah. Well, it looked like Professor Gallagher was about to press the. Go ahead. You go. Go ahead. You go, and then I'll go after. Just go ahead. Go.
It's actually kind of a question partially to you, so that works out. One of the questions is we can clearly see a divided country. Many say it's due to the era of misinformation. I can't remember if somebody else took this up. Due to social media and the mass media involvement, what can we do to reunite the country? I mean, one thing when I was thinking about the Electoral College is there is really an emerging consensus, right? And I wonder, or not an emerging consensus. I mean, there has been a majority of voters voting to have the conversations that the Democratic Party is having. And as you said, there's a limit to voter suppression. And so I wonder, I mean, I don't know, I guess the question is pushing back on something that I think we all take for granted, which is that we're more divided than ever. If we took out the non-democratic institutions, right, like we're not actually that divided in some ways, and we're going to be less divided, we know, because demographically it's going to shift more and more away from the flag, the racist exclusionary flag that the Republican Party has planted. So I wonder, I guess I wanted to push back on the premise of the question and see Professor Morel as the Americanist in the room, if that's a fair reading.
Sorry about that. I was on mute. That was the question that I was going to try to address too, in addition to the other question about the institution. So, so I think they do come together, and I think you put it together very, very nicely. We are a lot closer on many issues than I think most would have us believe, right? And I agree entirely that if we were to adopt certain institutional changes, it would allow for that to essentially, grow, right? Allow that to be a possibility. So I'll come back to that in a second, but I want to first go to some of the question regarding the institutional changes, which will, I think, along with your argument here, would allow for some of that to happen. And so some of the reforms that I think need to happen is, for example, automatic voter registration. So when you turn 18, everybody should be automatically registered to vote. You shouldn't have to go through any process. We should have a holiday for voting, right? So the entire country shuts down so that everybody can go participate. I think we should have ranked choice voting. I think that we need to end the filibuster. I think that we do need to think about court reforms, as has already been discussed. And we certainly, related to finances, I think we certainly need to end Citizens United, right? So some of these things, we remove some of these things, then it allows for democracy to actually work. And by allowing it to work, we'll notice that there is a lot more consensus than what we have now, right? So for instance, Congress can't do anything on gun issues, anything, right? And you would think that the American public is divided on this, but we're really not divided. There's a majority of Americans who think that we should have some sort of, checks on purchasing and using guns, right? So that's just one example. We can think about many. On issues of inequality, I think that there's more consensus around dealing with economic issues to address the needs of people who are struggling than Congress right now is able to do. So there's a lot. The one area where I don't think that there's is as easily addressed through opening democratic means, and certainly a lot more work needs to be done on this, is on racial issues, particularly with those of Black Americans, right? And so I think there is no, I think we've tried to ignore it. I think we've, try to say, all right, we went through a civil rights movement and we elected the first Black president, so things should be fine. And we have avoided dealing with racial issues in this country, whether it's, the killing of unarmed Black people, whether it's dealing with the economic oppression that touches every aspect of our lives, including politics. So all of these things, this is why we're dealing with this racial reckoning in this moment. And so I don't think that there is a going back to some sort of reunification of American. I don't think that can happen. I think that if we want to arrive at a place of more unison, we have to go through this, and we have to deal with this in ways that we have neglected to do forever, And so, because even the Civil War was fought, and the concept shortly thereafter, we deal with post-Reconstruction and the Jim Crow era that emerges out of that, which further marginalized people. So this moment, I think I would be very hesitant to support an idea that what can we do to kind of reunify. I think we need to really be thinking about a different future that looks very different from our past, right? And so it's hard work, and it's ugly, and it's that's why we see people out in the streets, and I think it's part of that reckoning, that part of that democratic imagination of something better for all of us.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Morel. And I think you're channeling me somehow, because I was going to ask that each of you give sort of a 1-minute conclusion. And the question was going to be, how do you see these movements continuing into 2021? There are movements across Europe. There are movements across Latin America. There are movements across Africa. This is like the year of the movement, sort of. And there's certainly movements in the US. So in your final minute before we close tonight, and I do want to say thank you for your time. Thank you, students, for your participation. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions. We're just going to have to follow this up again next year. But, in the final minute, how do you see these movements continuing or ending in 2021? And we can start with Dr. Reich, Dr. Gallagher, Professor Togan, and Professor Morel. 1 minute. Thank you.
Okay. Samuel Huntington, very famous political scientist, of whom in general I'm not a big fan politically, wrote a book about 30 years ago, and he talked about periods of creedal passion. And periods of creedal passion occur approximately every 50 years. The last period of creedal passion was the civil rights movement that Dr. Morel mentioned earlier. We're bang on course for a creedal passion period. In those periods, what happens is American institutions are more prone to align with the democratic values that they're supposed to represent. So on my optimistic days, I hope that that's exactly what we're seeing now. It started with the Tea Party and then Wall Street, and it's culminating in Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement. And what I'm hoping is that America will rediscover its values in, starting with a transitionary Biden regime, and then presumably a Kamala Harris regime. We'll have 12 years of the Democratic Party, and we'll have a return to those kind of values that are supposed to represent the Republic.
Thank you. Dr. Gallagher?
This is a hard question to do in a minute on the spot, and especially the way in which I try to be hopeful in my life and classes, and I think I don't feel hopeful in answering that question. I mean, I feel hopeful because I think the material conditions of people are going to continue to be really hard and to get worse. And I think that's going to keep people on the streets. I think that's going to keep people mobilized. I think we have built institutions in the US which are really, and insulated them. We built institutions to preserve inequality and to preserve white supremacy and to preserve the way things have always been, and we have then insulated them with things like Citizens United, right? So, and I think this is true in a lot in America where I study too. You have entrenched institutions which have gotten pretty nimble at self-preservation. Again, Chile makes me really excited because they're going after the heart of the structure of inequality in the country. So I'm really excited to see that happening. I don't see that happening. I'm not an Americanist. Again, I hope Professor Morel can, in the 2 minutes he has to plan, and on a higher note than I am, but I think it's going to take a lot to translate this protest into institutional change, right? It's going to take a lot to do the kinds of things that we're talking about, especially the Electoral College, right? So to actually get, it's incredibly difficult to pass a constitutional amendment. It's incredibly difficult to overturn a Supreme Court decision, especially with the in terms of Citizens United, in terms of the configuration of the court. So for me, it's really, and I should say, and I'm a social movement, it's what I study is social movements. And I think that Professor Reich is exactly, I'm talking too long, I'll stop. Professor Reich is exactly right. We're gonna see a wave of protests, but I think things are gonna get worse for a lot of people before they get better.
Thank you for that, Professor Togan.
Things will get worse before they get better. Sadly, I actually do agree with that as well. But I will say, I think citizens have decided that the systems that govern all of us, right, is not working. That's why we see these things happening across continents, right? And we are in the middle, and it's all happening in the midst of a global pandemic, right? We have lots of people getting together in close contact when we know that one of the ways to get this virus is in close contact, right? So in spite of that, folks have decided that we actually have bigger things that we need to fight. So actually that gives me hope, right? So I don't know that, I think Dr. Gallagher is right that our institutions probably across the globe, but certainly in the US, are not necessarily equipped to handle in this moment. But my hope is that this desire and this sort of push that but enough people have, and in the world of global connections, that it actually allows us to push our institutions further towards answering these questions, right? And sort of finding solutions. I don't know what those solutions are, but I'm actually, generally speaking, an optimist by nature. And so my hope is that we find ways to galvanize together and get to those solutions, and whatever they might be, but they will be hopefully different in different places, but that there's a global movement and there's a global connection that we're having that will hopefully get us somewhere, wherever that place is.
Thank you for that. Professor Morel, before you go, I just want to give a special shout out to our IT guru, Isaac Jimenez, SASN, for keeping us on and audible and the questions and everything. So thank you, Isaac. Okay, last but not least, Professor Morel.
Yeah. So I am hopeful, but perhaps in different ways, right? So this presidency, Donald Trump's presidency is considered increasingly so as illegitimate, right? And so just his inability to provide the type of governance that we need to address all of these challenges that we're dealing with, has questioned his legitimacy as president. And if he were to win, I think that would just, I think people are, I think, kind of like the train has left the station, right? Like, I think people are going to be challenging this. And so no matter what, we're in it for, it's going to be a challenge for his presidency in terms of people accepting it, right? If Biden wins, I think that there is this battle happening within the Democratic Party for a very different vision of what this country should look like. And so that battle, whether he win, I mean, if he wins, I don't think is going to go anywhere. I think this is a prolonged struggle for a different America. And so while people would like to see Biden get elected to restore some sort of civility in this country, and it might very well be the case, I look at it a little bit differently. I think his presidency should signify even more airing out of our long enduring challenges, right? Give this the moment for us to address things that we haven't been able to address. So I'm not really about restoring, I'm about looking forward to something completely different than we've had in our country. So, I mean, so in that sense, I'm hopeful.
Thank you all. I just want to let everyone know that we plan to do another session next semester, either 60 days after the election, after the swearing in, or 100 days after the swearing in. But this is a goal of the department to keep letting you know what we're thinking and to keep you all engaged. So with that, vote, wear a mask, be safe, and see you soon. Take care.
Thank you, Hyacinth.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.